So I think we can start then. Yeah. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everyone, and welcome Rocky to our development studies lecture series. So we're really excited and happy to have Dr. Rocky Ziipao with us, who's going to be talking about his latest book, which is titled Infrastructures of Injustice, State and Politics in Manipur and Northeast India. Rocky is based at, he teaches sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay. He works on areas around the politics of infrastructure, as his doctoral work in the book is based on, and works on socio-anthropology of infrastructure, looks at questions of social policies with particular reference to what he calls infrastructural deficit areas, and also looks at the same time at questions of tribal and indigenous epistemology. He's also a part of the Tribal Intellectual Collective India, TIKI, which sort of engages with scholars and is a collective of scholars and academics who work on tribal and Adivasi and indigenous issues and sort of reflect on questions of tribal and indigenous epistemology, which also informs his work and the way he writes, etc. So we're really excited to to have you speak to us, especially given our location in the Northeast becomes all the more relevant, especially with our development studies program. It speaks so closely to the kinds of questions that we discuss and talk about and teach and research within the department. So we're really happy to have you here, and welcome, and over to you. So about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we can open it up for discussion with the students and, well, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for your generous introductions. And yeah, I'll stick to around 35 to 40 minutes. Basically, I will speak from my book, Infrastructure of Injustice, State and Politics in Manipur and Northeast India, which was published by Raile last year in 2020. But before doing so, I wanted to take you all, my interest in the study of infrastructure. It in fact begins from my home village of Hamai. So during monsoon, the roads are not drivable, and electricity is so regular that in some places there are electric poles with no wires. So people have to climb to top of the mountain for cell services, for instance. And to get to school, students have to walk for miles. When I go to other parts of the country, the infrastructure is much better. So I began to wonder why infrastructure is so bad, especially in a tribal dominated areas. Hence, my research project is to understand the politics and social dynamics of building infrastructure. So in this sensitive social and political context of India's border and frontier region, it also become crucial to research the impact of infrastructure development on ecosystems, communities, and livelihoods. So infrastructure, for that matter, entails connectivity, circulation of goods, and movement of people. It also establishes ideas, crosses social cultural boundaries, maintain and expand social intersections, and deepens community relations. However, in a state like Manipur, characterized by persistent social conflict, infrastructure is an extremely political issue. And from an academic point of view, infrastructure provides deep insight into issues of access, inclusion and exclusion, equity, social justice, and state policy and practices. So drawing from my ethnography study of these processes, in fact, my analysis gives primacy to infrastructure within the development discourse. So the book, in fact, these entangle the patterns and distribution of infrastructure in Manipur, a chronically conflict-ridden state with a specific focus on roads and electricity. Although there are areas of infrastructure such as airways, waterways, railways, and telecommunications, which are equally important. But these are in their nascent stage and therefore have a minimal impact on a political and economic power play in a state like Manipur. So when we look at about this, the literature and aspects of infrastructure, the socio-anthropological work on infrastructure that begins to draw together a set of this diverse interests in technology, in material relationships and also in material agency, that fostering a close relationship between science and technology studies and also ethnography approaches to the analysis of technological systems, social change, and also development. For instance, this Larkin Seminal's work, he posits that infrastructure also exists as a form separate from the purely technical functioning, and they need to be analyzed as a concrete, semiotic, and aesthetic vehicles oriented to addresses. So for him, infrastructure occupy a peculiar ontology that they are things and also the relation between things, thus enabling the movement of other matter. Similarly, this Hannah and others also make a similar argument by theorizing that contemporary infrastructure are critical sites through which social and political systems are given form and perform. So, well, they promise circulation and distribution. At the same time, these precarious assemblies also threaten to break down and fail. And the material and the political lives of infrastructure reveals fragile relation between people, things, and institution, both public and private, that seek to govern them. So this book takes a critical positions in order to unravel multiple ways of seeing infrastructure. Theoretically, it is located within the framework and concept called this infrastructure of injustice. And I analyze the materiality of infrastructure, but in conceptualizing this phenomena, I'm also positioning it within the concept called infrastructure of injustice. It nevertheless a field that dovetails well with the socio-anthropology of infrastructure and political economy of development literature. In addition to this domain, I also elaborated on and added the dimension of conflict, justice or injustice, and lived experiences into the studies of infrastructure. So basically, this book presents the intersections of development studies, social anthropology of infrastructure, and science and technology and society. Looking at about the literature, social scientists, in fact, pay scant attention to the materiality and forms of infrastructure that manifest injustice, particularly in a difficult terrain like Northeast India. So the crucial question, the fundamental question is, how is injustice embedded in infrastructure? And one way forward to unearth this phenomena in relations to tribes is through the lens of decolonial perspective, or what came to be called the perspective from within by the tribal intellectual collective India. So what I found is that the socio-political economic issues plaguing tribes in India are too complex for the existing dominant social theory to adequately address the issue of situating as well as explaining the reality. Hence, it is imperative to approach from different perspectives, drawing on the experience from indigenous studies across the globe. For instance, indigenous people in South America assert concepts such as like perspectivism and decolonial thinking. In North America, the focus is on decolonial method. Well, indigenous scholars from South Africa engage with decolonizations and indigenization processes. The Maoris of New Zealand, especially the writings of Linda Tohiwa Smith, posit decolonizing methodology as the way forward. So, and indigenous people from Australia assert, truth telling, healing, and decolonization of the stolen generations by the colonizer. And here, the seminal work of this Boaventura de Santos, titled with Epistemology of the South, Justice Against Epistemicides, gives an emancipatory approach to knowledge production and depart from the Eurocentric critical traditions. So in the context of tribal slash Adivasi slash indigenous studies in India, Bodhi and Jojo, they certainly sum up that until about early 2000, it was going through an interim crisis, as in the all was dying and new not yet born. However, in the midst of this theoretically saturated state and minor historical rupture took place, and the contour of the new is beginning to unravel, frame around the perspective from within. And here, I drove from this decolonial perspective and also located my work within the concept of infrastructure of injustice. But in order to understand the poverty of infrastructure in tribal areas, we also need to understand the different aspects of its history. particularly in the context of Northeast, which set it on the particular development path, followed by the colonial rule and subsequently by the dominant community's narrative. Hence, one could locate the poverty or crumbling of infrastructure in tribal-dominated district of Manipur as a byproduct of the colonial rule and also the dominant community state hegemony. And this brings me to the argument of infrastructure of injustice. Why is there so much poverty of infrastructure in the hills? Is there poverty of infrastructure in the valley like in Manipur? What are the constraints of the state on infrastructure development in the hills? What are the perspective of the communities on infrastructure? Above all, my book attempts to analyze the socio-political economic processes that breed injustice in infrastructure development in the conflict-ridden state of Manipur. So if we look at what we call Northeast India today, or in the touristic lexicon, Seven Sisters, now Seven Sisters and plus one brother before, with Sikkim being part of it. So Northeast before independence consisted of Assam province, Assam tribal areas, Manipur state, Tripura state, and Khasi state. So within the province of Assam, the British created various administrative categories, namely the normal areas, partially excluded areas, and excluded areas. The normal areas like where Golpura, Kamrup, Daran, Nogon, Sibsagar, Lakhimpur, and Kachar districts. And the partially excluded area includes Garo Hills, Khasi, and Janta Hills. And the excluded areas include the Naga Hills, the Lusai Hills. Further, if you look at within the Kachar district, the Kachar Hills subdivisions was regarded as an excluded area, and within two districts of Nogon and Subsigar, the Mikir Hills portion was regarded as partially excluded areas. And the Assam tribal areas were the northeast frontier tract, including what's called this Balipara frontier tracts, Abor and Mismi Hill tracts, and the Naga tribal areas. So when we look at about this historically, all the hill territories, with the exceptions of a small area in Shillong, were demarcated as either partially excluded or excluded areas by the British India. Hence, it was the British who created the binary between the hills and valley on the basis of geospatial differences, civilizations, culture, and traditions. So the geographical location of varied communities in Northeast India invariably, in fact, fits to Scott's argument about Southeast Asia, like the tribes, Nagas, Mizos, Garos, Khasis, Kukis, etc. In his term, would form a noun state space, an eligible space from the perspective of the state in the lowlands. And today, the region is experiencing the ramifications of the colonial geopolitics. And this has a bearing on infrastructure, sense of belonging, territories, boundaries, culture, and so on and so forth. For those communities that later came to be known as scheduled tribes in India, or more specifically, hill people in Northeast India. And one could historically locate the infrastructure of injustice within the regions from the framework of colonial administration and the panoplies of laws, policies, and regulations. Infrastructure facilities such as roads, bridges, irrigations, waterways, dispensaries, postal services, and guest house, among others, in the are mostly found in what is called the normal areas of the Assam province, and which are much more well equipped as compared to those what is called in these excluded areas. Here, I also wanted to bring about the concept of justice a bit, but it is in fact beyond the scope of this book to discuss the theory of justice in detail. Hence, I limit my discussion to what is relevant in the context of justice and injustice of infrastructure. If we look at about the liberal utilitarian principles of social justice, exposes that the greatest happiness of the greatest number in the context of infrastructure in Northeast India would amount to injustice to those communities that are at the margin of the state and the dominant communities. Hence, it is also problematic to conceptualize justice from the perspectives of utilitarianisms in this study, and more so in the domains of infrastructural distributions. But if I look at about John Rawls' critique and bemoans the utilitarian concept of justice, for Rawls, justice is the first virtue of social institution, wherein he theorized justice as fairness, So echoing from Rawls' theory of justice in the context of infrastructure accessibility and also distribution, infrastructure in Manipur and Northeast would ensure, Northeast should ensure a fair or just manner among different social categories. Here I can take the example of tribals and non-tribals. And if one community appropriates all the resources and avail all primary goods, including basic infrastructure, for itself, then this would amount to injustice. So Rawls' conceptions of justice as fairness provides the basic structure of the argument. And this basic structure becomes unfair when one community appropriates the benefits of all goods and services. Hence, the benefits of infrastructure should be fair and just for all communities, irrespective of their social locations and geographical terrain within a nation state framework. Equally, it is also interesting to note the conceptions of social justice as propounded by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the context of Indian society, which is marked by a pervasive caste systems. His concept is based on the principle of equality, liberty, and fraternity in all social categories. So, for him, social justice would mean to annihilate the caste system based on graded inequality and removal of all inequalities existing in this society. Echoing Ambedkar's perspective, infrastructural justice would mean equal access to all infrastructural facilities, irrespective of caste, tribe, religion, gender, and among others. So, when certain social groups support a dominant caste appropriate infrastructure and deny access to other social groups, this is injustice. So fair and just distribution of materiality amongst various social categories in India and the Northeast in particular is one way forward to address the questions of infrastructural injustice. So there's a differential access to material resources or physical infrastructure, be it roads, electricity, telecommunication, hospitals, school, colleges, universities, among others, based on the locations and power dynamics is the hallmark what Kaka called the hallmark of Indian society and germinate social exclusion. So Professor Kaka, in fact, posited that difference have become the hallmark of Indian society and that certain social categories are historically being excluded, like tribes. So these differences, in fact, emerge as the result of various long and complex historical processes. Hence, it is imperative to address the historical injustice meted out to certain social groups, such as tribes, Adivasis, and Dalits in India. So if I look at the work of Amartya Sen in his seminal work titled Idea of Justice, where he deals with the concept of justice in early Indian jurisprudence between Niti and Nyaya, the amount of principal uses of the term Niti are organizational, proprietary, and behavioral correctness. So in contrast with Niti, the term Nyaya stands for a comprehensive concept of realized justice. In that line of visions, the role of institution, rules, and organization, important as they are, have to be accessed in a broader and more inclusive perspective. And here I would like to quote Amartya Sen's, which I fact from my book, in the words of Amartya Sen, at a, even hosted by the Asian Society, Northern California in 2010. He said, neglects of tribal is a huge sport in India's pursuit of justice. And he said, I very much rebel against the view saying we ought to do something about it. Otherwise, they would join the Naxalites. So, for instance, if we can, if you take in the context of Northeast insurgents in the case of Northeast India, and continue that the reason we should do something about them is precisely because it's a matter of justice. So justice does reflect the ideology of development. Hence, addressing the historical injustice meted out against certain social groups in India would echo the development with justice. The connotations, concept, categories, and uses of the term tribe for me, especially in this book, is markedly different from what is commonly understood in the Europe or a Western or caste-centric anthropological writings, which categorize tribes as savage, barbaric, backward people without history, among others. So tribes in this book refers to noun-caste society in India and people with a distinct history, culture, traditions, identity, autonomy, sense of territory, boundaries, like intrinsic relationship with nature, and varied mode of productions, political entity, and also victims of several waves of colonialisms. So this book, in fact, analyzes the socio and political processes of infrastructure building, which breed infrastructure at the same time, and also build on my research work, which I've done at field work in 2013 to 14. There are, in fact, 7 chapters. Chapter 1 focuses on the imperative of infrastructure development in a landlocked state. So, as I said, in the sensitive socio and political context of India, border and frontier region, infrastructure resonate with a unique material agencies as a fostering a close correlation with ethnicity. And this chapter also unfolds how infrastructure build out in the region. It's ensnared in a binary space of military versus civil, hills versus valley, tribes versus non-tribals, and center versus alternative center. It posits that the state approach to building infrastructure in the hills is more of the future investment rather than a response to the needs emerging from the communities. And this chapter argues that the concept of modernity framed within the perspective of the state at the behest of the dominant communities amounts to the denial of justice to tribal society. Chapter 2 details the political economy of development in Manipur. And this chapter, in fact, locates how the Hills Valley divide continue to be a defining political space and the lane of infrastructure in the state. I conclude this chapter by arguing that Manipur's development experience illuminates how the unequal power relations of various ethnic communities led to social unrest, development disparities, deep hostility, and structural inequality. It unearths an emerging perspective of development from the lived experiences of tribal society and illustrates how tribes are subjugated in the ambits of the dominant hegemon. Chapter 3, of course, look at the various communities, relationship, and issues of contradictions and contestation. It traces the historical locations of communities known as scheduled tribes in Manipur. And the political economy of the state is vividly brought out, and so too is the deprivations of the scheduled tribe in the state. This chapter also provides a historical outline of the state's power structure and argues that the state of Manipur has always put the interests of the dominant community at the forefront, while the tribes remain marginalized. Chapter 4, which I title as Political Highways and its Tributaries, examine the ontology of roads and how the very act of building the roads breed injustice. It traces the budgetary allocation of funds for road development from 1947 to 2014 and its outcome. So combining empirical evidence and secondary data, I capture road disparities in the state and examine the concept of roads from Pumai Naga tribe narrative and lived experience. So the chapter also describes how roads have become political highway that are frequently the target of the blockades used to intensify, protest movement that draw attention to local issues. And chapter 5 looks at the political economy of electricity and also budgetary discriminations. This chapter raises the questions like how are rural villages electrified yet without electricity? So is the new policy change electricity a reform in IFSL or mere prepaid metering? And the chapter in fact captured the Hills Valley electricity divide and the dynamics of bill generations. I argue that electricity as much as a circulatory regimes and network of connectivity effectively also transmit injustice. And chapter 6, I look at about the intricate nexus of various stakeholders in building infrastructure and subsequently shed lights on the social and political processes of creating and maintaining infrastructure. This chapter discusses in detail the interlinkages between various stakeholders, such as tribals, bureaucrats, ministers, contractors, and insurgents. And this chapter also points how the parallel forms of civil administration, one by the government of Manipur, the other by insurgent groups, have paraded the common citizens in a perpetual state of insecurity and anxiety. And the last chapter 7, I argues that the nexus in building infrastructure is not only limited to politicians and bureaucrats, contractors. Rather, it also includes insurgents, value-centric elites, and even civil society in the webs of corruptions of various kinds. So, in other words, we put it the rent-seeking behavior. So, this chapter posits that the political life of infrastructure, the non-human agencies enveloped in the shadow of ethnic contestations and insurgency, steeped in corruption and nexus, reveals contemporaneous development practice. And I conclude this by showing how infrastructure opens up a new avenue to unfold the space of injustice as well as sites for protest and negotiation. So, in nutshell, Manipur's development resonates with a scapegoat syndromes. And just to kind of quickly conclude, just wanted to summarize that. I said my book look at the politics of infrastructure development in Manipur and argue that infrastructure has always been an egg of power, which at different times been leveraged to smooth relationships, connect or disconnect people, enable trade, create spaces of contestation or dilute boundaries between varied ethnic groups. And these are key to unraveling a larger political discourse. And the focus of the study was, of course, on roads and electricity. Of course, although there are also other areas of critical infrastructure, which I pointed like railways, waterways, telecommunications, so on and so forth. And here, one of the key issue in the politics of infrastructure is the power dynamics, in that it has a historical roots. The main player in the politics are the major ethnic communities of Meiteis, Nagas, and Zaus. So these communities are marked by asymmetrical land relationships. Every community has its own ancestral claim over its land systems. Well, some are antithetical to each other, as is the case with Nagas and Kukis, which witness the bloodiest ethnic conflict over the claim and assertions of ancestral land and territory. Other ethnic communities simply make historical claims over land through legal institutions and constructed histories. So physical infrastructure invariably builds upon land, and it is thus a political activity. And the power relationship determines how infrastructure is planned and executed. To conclude, in Manipur, there is no fairness in the distribution of infrastructure across varied social groups. The hills valley divide of the tribal and non-tribal binary in terms of infrastructure facilities stem from the complex historical processes and systematic discrimination meted out to tribes. So fundamental to the life of physical infrastructure is intrinsic connections to land. Infrastructure, I say this built on land. So land and identity among the tribes are intrinsically related to each other. And mega infrastructure invariably fragments land, village community, and also identity. The fragmentations of the holistic constructions of identity in the process of infrastructure build out amounts to injustice and creates varied kinds of conflict within the community, vis-a-vis communities and state. So infrastructure, as much as its connect and build network, also destroys communities and state structure and identity. When land is turned into a commodity and the state and dominant community appropriate such land for infrastructure development, the original inhabitants lost control over the land, leading to the injustice. More so when the benefits from such infrastructure development is not accrued to tribe, which is often the case, then it perpetuates injustice, or what I call infrastructure of injustice. With such development, a new governance system comes into play, and tribes are forever dispossessed of their land. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Rocky, for giving us also a sense of sort of locating the book within its broader theoretical and political concepts and a certain perspective, and then sort of laying out the various parts of the book. So thanks a lot. The floor is open for discussion. So if anyone would like to ask a question, have a comment, it's open for that. For those of you joining from YouTube, you can always write down the question and we can read it out. So anyone who has a question? Okay, while everyone's thinking and giving them time to respond, I was also wondering if maybe if you could speak just a little bit more about, on your fourth and fifth chapters, which are the ones on the highways and the one on electricity, in terms of the dynamic that you were talking about amongst communities. Just how does it pan out in terms of thinking of roads as bringing in justice and thinking of electricity as mediums for reinforcing injustice, right, or reproducing that unjust relationship? If you could just sort of speak a little bit more about that dynamic between different communities.
Okay, great. Yes, I can just particularly spell out. If to begin with, I'd like to give one example where I did a field work in a village which is around 45 kilometers away from national highway. So there is one particular village which was not connected by given the electricity. Well, what is quite interesting is about that village is that when the villagers approached the state for the electrifications of that particular village, the electric poles were given, and the villagers volunteers then lay out all the electric poles, but there was not electric wires to connect. So this also I call the amounts to injustice. For instance, of the what are the social and the political processes, and towards the end here, they ran from pillar to post for nearly 5, 6, 7 years, and they started resorting to buying the solar plate by spending a huge amount. So whosoever can offer can pay for it. That is what also amounts to electrified without electricity. So here, when I argued about building of infrastructure like roads and electricity is very much political in nature, in the sense that who decides where the infrastructure comes out. So looking at about a scenario like in Manipur, where private investments or things are at the nascent state, so it relies on the responsibility of the state to build an infrastructures. Certain there is variations in terms of infrastructure build out both in the valley and the hill district. So I was comparing the districts, but in Manipur, taking about the case of roads and electricity, and also looked at about how much budget is being allocated in each year. And not only that, what are the dynamics in terms of different agencies being involved into building those processes, and where are money is going on, where is that being invested, so in which pockets the money is going, how are the relations between say bureaucrats and the contractor operates, what are the relationship between insurgents and with the contractor, and also the roles of the ministers and the roles of those in the power. So that's are the things I try to bring out and also locate, why there is a crumbling of infrastructure in such areas. So for instance, if one particular project, as sum of rupees 1 crore has been sanctioned, and not even 50% of that amount actually get implemented. And more so, all the materials for building infrastructure comes from mostly from other states. So there was one interesting case where I did an ethnography study where I traveled in a truck loaded with 14 tons of goods. I traveled from Dimapur till Imphal and trying to locate how many checkposts are there and how many places there is an illegal taxations, both by the state and non-state actors. I was calculating that from this Dimapur till Imphal. Was curious why is that the material cost of the things are very expensive in places like Manipur. And there was a nice calculation which also came out by the Northeastern Council, wherein if the cost of construction in Delhi is 100 rupees, it will cost 200 rupees in Manipur, and it will cost 120 rupees in Assam, 160 rupees in or 180 rupees in Nagaland, and it goes on like Arunachal. So given these complex ethnic contestations and also about the very nexus of different agency, I call it that this nexus goes beyond what is called this famous unholy trinity. Earlier there was a concept that okay, the bureaucrats, ministers, and contractor, there's a nexus. But now there are also other different stakeholders, even civil society are also part of it. So those are the things which I look at on my chapter 4 and 5 here.
Okay, thanks, thanks. I do have one more question, but I'm going to wait for others to raise their hand for questions. There seems to be a message.
Yeah, I can see there is one question on the chat box from you.
Yeah, not showing up on my. Yeah.
How do you then propose to undertake required developmental works in tribal areas without causing any injustice? Well, that's an excellent question, and I so wish that there can be a, infrastructure development without causing any injustice, especially the tribal communities. That is where I also posited development with justice, in the sense that we, of course, we talk development become a buzzword. So also, sustainable development from Millennium Development Goal, now it is going to Sustainable Development Goal. There is a participatory development. There is a good governance, one, all those things. But here the concern is that when I discuss about development with justice, how can we also, take respect the culture of, say, here in context of tribals, and also treat them equally as stakeholders, and also treat them as, self governance aspects. When it talks about this development with justice, it also paramounts to take in the collaborations or the ethos of the tribal communities. Say, for instance, if we look, there is a perception, the discourse that tribes are anti-development. But I don't think that is true. What tribes saying is that we don't want this kind of development which is going to take away our land. We also want a development which promotes the well-being and the welfare of our people. And also, like when I was doing my field work, there's always assertions that, especially in those border areas inhabited by Kemogan or Konyak in Indo-Myanmar border, they were saying that we don't want to be, subjected to heavy militarization, securitization, in the sense that even when I go to my Zoom field, you are being checked. We are being freaked by the securities. Instead, they are asking that we at least need a good road, which we can connect to the market and also regular electricity supply. So I think the concepts that tribes are anti-development, tribes are anti-nations, I think I like to deconstruct that very concept. But the argument is that we don't want this kind of development which takes away all our land. We want also to be part of development, and the development does not accrue to certain different directions. And here I can give one example again in Manipur, in Churachampur district, that is called Kuka Dam. It took more than 25 years to construct that dam, spending more than 300 crores. But the utility of that dam is, picnic spot. Until today, not even a zero, not even a single unit of electricity has been generated. So in the cause of submerge in many villages, displacement of thousands of people, and the people, those who the landowner have lost them, the land permanently. I don't know whether I
Yeah.
really answered your question or no. Sorry about it.
I'm going to ask Archita Mijingsha, if your mics are working, why don't you unmute yourselves and ask the questions instead? Because everyone seems to be moving to the chat mode. I just wanted to also just add, while I was listening to you, I mean, there were two things that resonated very closely. I was doing my fieldwork in Jharkhand, and there was a case of exactly that. It was supposed to be a multi-purpose project with irrigation and all of that. They built the canals. The canals were empty, and it was simply a boating spot. And the reservoir had become, just a picnic spot was the only source of income that people were able to draw from there. So the entire money that was spent just sort of went to waste and produced nothing in terms of developmental works or any kind of useful infrastructure. And the other that reminded me was also when I was in Ukhrul district where Mapithal Dam was being built. And over there they were speaking about roads, in fact. And I remembered it when you were talking about securitization, whether uh, he specifically told me, my host with whom I was traveling, who said, "Look, it's not that we don't want roads. We understand, of course, we want roads, but we don't want this road because this is the road by which the army comes in, and they don't allow us to go by this road, and then they go to the dam, and this is the road by which they are bringing increased militarization into the area. So it's not that it was exactly that. It's not that we're anti-road or anti-development, but we understand the meaning of what this road brings in, and that is what we're anti. So I was just thinking of that. Archita, would you, if you, okay, let me read out your question. She's saying, in terms of the decolonization of development theory, how could the praxis of decolonized development look like in Northeast India?
Well, to answer your question, I don't have a concrete answer to that. I have to reflect upon on that aspects. I'm sorry, but see, we are attempting, especially in a small group, this tribal intellectual collective India, we are started positioning now, development in sense that we there should be also elements of justice being addressed to these communities who are being discriminated, who are being excluded for decades. So why can't they had also become the part of the discourse when we're talking about the development issues? But in terms of the practice of decolonized development, I really have to reflect upon on it.
Yeah. There's a question by Mijing Shah, who's doing his PhD with us. He's saying, thank you, Dr. Ziipao, for a wonderful lecture. How would you look at the processes of dispossession as a result of state-constructed infrastructure? Can we expect the state working as a facilitator for dispossession of land for the private corporations in the future, if it hasn't started now in the Northeast?
Well, that's an excellent question. And if we look at about the processes of these positions, also the role of the state, I think here it is also very crucial, particularly in a geographical terrain like Northeast India, whereas also position talks about where the private investment is at the nation state. So it is the role of the state, what there comes into as a facilitator for building of infrastructure. And if we look ideally in this urban development, all those things, when infrastructure like schools, building, university comes up, the infrastructure also get deep inside it. But most of it, in particularly in Northeast, like the state of Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, the states has a huge role. And one thing we should also need to keep in mind is in those states, there are also certain constitutional provisions which give the protective aspects. Say, for instance, Article 371C for Manipur. So also there's a special provision in the context of Nagaland. Wherever the laws acts been passed in the parliament doesn't apply to the state of Nagaland until unless it is ratified by the legislative assembly. And here I see the contradiction, the dialectics in terms of what is already been there, and also say, look at the examples of India's Look East policy, which is now re-christians as Act East policy. And one of the thrust area of Act East policy is deepening trade relation with Southeast Asia. In order to deepen that trade relations, buildings of infrastructure becomes imperative. So the role of the state gets into deeper in that aspect. But here the another aspect is that when building a road, if those roads bypasses the local economy and bypasses the local people, is this about the transformation of capital from one part of the country to other parts to the Southeast Asia? Or is Northeast just as a transit point, that becomes a crucial aspect. And if we look at about the terms of in terms of allocations in terms of building roads, say there's a special accelerated road development program for Northeast. And there are also like Frontiers Highway. There are also Friendship Highways. Asian Highway #1 is passing through in the middle of Northeast and goes through from the Moray and connect to Myanmar. So the role of the state, in fact, is crucial, this aspect. At the same time, how would state address to very questions of these positions, acquisitions of land, and which is already happening. So it's and on the extremes, there is also cases wherein there are what is called designated international trade centers, which are predominantly inhabited by tribals, say for instance, Indo-Naga Myanmar border. But there are no roads, not motorable roads. There are 4 international trade centers. None of the trade center has got even bank or bazaar or no town. And when there is no roads to connect, how do one also looks about the role of the state, and also visions of the Look Act East policy. So there is a imminent contradictions of what is being envisaged and what is being operated at the ground.
Thanks. Are there any other questions anyone would like to? Yes, Sandra.
Hi, sir. I'm Sandra Kurian, final year MA Development Studies. I loved your talk. It was so interesting and energetic. Just wanted to ask a question. Sorry if my question overlaps. Like in Northeast, where there is constant social unrest and conflict between state, police, and communities, like even between two tribes. What do you think on the role of the government in implementing infrastructure? Isn't it limited? Like, of course, it is limited by the interest of the dominant communities, but how do you propose to undertake infrastructure activities in such a socially unrest condition? And thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for your questions. In fact, last year, this Niti Aayog, UNDP, Government of Assam, Tata Trust organized on this sustainable development conclave on sustainable development notice, and fortunately, I was also invited. So the paper which I presented there, of course, got published in the strategic analysis, and I propose, of course, like a small model wherein I say like the agency like NEC, Northeastern Council, it's not functioning like what has been envisaged. And you can also see that there are vision documents of the vision documents. There is a Northeastern vision, Northeastern Region Vision 2020. There is also Northeast Digital Visions of 2022. And there is a Look East policy, Northeast policy. But that doesn't really get materialized. So I was proposing to the Niti Aayog, can we have something like Northeast infrastructure missions? And root all the centrally funded project in that particular missions, where there are committee members drawing from various disciplines, be it in the academia or the engineers, whatnot. And say, for instance, when it comes to roads, also we can entrust to the border roads organizations. So there is a sharp difference in terms of roads maintained by the border roads organizations and the roads maintained by the state respective PWD, Public Works Department. So both in terms of quality as well as the durability, there's a sharp difference. So I was kind of proposing that idea, the Northeast infrastructure missions, wherein, of course, whatever is being funded by the respective state government, let that be implemented by the respective PWDs. But when it comes to, centrally sponsored infrastructure project, route it through, that particular missions and implement it. So I said that is also one way forward to deepen this critical infrastructure in the places like Northeast. And I absolutely understand that the kind of social unrest in Northeast is in fact like no other place. But nevertheless, that social unrest should also not be a factor that one cannot build such infrastructure, say, for instance, a basic infrastructure. Because there are cases wherein there are hospitals without staff and doctors and nurses, schools without teachers, schools without a roof, roads that are not motorable, banks that are not bankable, it means that there are no staff. So provisions of this basic infrastructure, one can also materialize it. And of course, there is a rent-seeking behavior from different stakeholders involved, that also becomes complicated. So in these Northeast infrastructure missions, what some of these elements could be also addressed. Of course, not in the full proof though. That is what, of course, I suggested. I don't know how well it could functions though. But as an exercise, I did that.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or comment?
I think there is one on the chat box. How do you see the recent push by the central government for oil palm farming in Northeast? Once again, I've not really given a thought on this. I have to reflect on. But given about the experience in other parts of the world, you can assume, what would be the consequences of it. So.
Yeah, we have a question from Saurabh. Saurabh, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Ziipao. I really enjoyed the talk, and if I understood correctly, I would think that infrastructures of justice would be something that does not take away self-determination, agency, and autonomy of the people, especially the marginalized. So, coming to the question that I was thinking, more towards the idea of colonial relations, which ranges which comes out in layers from global to local, like north-south divide, and then state and region like India and Northeast, and then within Northeast, valley and hills, like you said. And so if I understood correctly, you talked a little bit about what you wrote in the 7th chapter about the emergence of elite class within the indigenous society or the tribal society. And that also forms an unequal power relation, which uh, acts out or is induced by this technocratic development model. And so in this emergence of unequal power relation, even within the indigenous or tribal societies, I wanted you to elaborate more on chapter 7, and also how do we fit this idea into the idea of decoloniality. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, I also somehow, to some extent, talks about the roles of elites, and also the elites. That doesn't mean only I talks about these tribal elites also, and also the contextation within the among the tribal communities, because one should, I think we should also keep in mind that tribes as a society, also tribes as a category, in the sense that for instance, Puma is might be very different from that of cookies. Cookies might be very different from that of Nagas, Tangkul. So tribes, there is also as a category. When I say that there is also the kind of the dynamics among the tribal groups as such, that there are also tribals which has got a population whose population is about 5 million, and there are also some tribal society whose are small, like 50 or 100. So here I would like to locate within these waves of colonialism taking place. So if we look initially, it was the British who got colonized the tribals, India and also the tribal. But there is also elements of, of course, Kaka called this a double form of colonialisms, wherein non-tribals are colonizing the tribal society. But when I was locating about the waves of colonialism, it's not only limited to the British or to the non-tribal, but there is also elements within the tribal society wherein there is also appropriations of the such things. So that one can also locate within the waves of colonialism, and also in terms of power relation, how it map out, how it shuts out between the tribes whose numerical who are very whose tribal societies are small in number, and others, like say, even in the context of Manipur, if I take the examples of Tangkuls and that of a Chote or the Anal, there is also sharp differences. So here the power dynamics also matter, and the other aspects about the roles of the elites, which I talks about, is how they also in a way collaborated becomes the agents of certain or powerful stakeholders, becomes the agents of propagating all those things. And not doubt about it, they get a different, that's how they also earn the livelihoods, by getting certain shares amount of that aspect, and that result into depriving certain other communities where the infrastructure should also be built out. And here I think it's also crucial to look at from the lens of this hills valley divide, both in terms of materiality as well as also in terms of budgetary allocations. And when it talks, besides that, there is also the political aspects. Who get represented, and who has the voice to say that? Say, for instance, I was looking some of the, I might be biased towards my observation, but during my field work, I was traveling in almost most of the roads in Northeast. Sorry, roads in Manipur, in the sense that to have a sense of difference between the valley roads in the valley as well as roads in the hills, and roads in the valley which have been sanctioned, which have not been materialized. So the roads that connect two tribal districts are either neglected or was not talked at all, or either put on a postpone for it. say the roads that connect Ukhrul and that of Sanapati, it's not been completed. And there is also a road, it's been already 18 years. It has not finished yet. Those are the things which lies in the tribal areas. And here one can also see in absence of the state, in Tamelong, there was one famous example of the People's Road, built by, initiated by the young IAS officer. So here I should say the roles of this power dynamics and the elite, of course, it matters a lot in that aspect in trying to understand about, building of the social political processes of infrastructure.
Thanks, Rocky. Is there anyone else? Any other questions or comments from anyone? From any of my colleagues? Or there seems to be something on YouTube. So this is a question that's come from someone, from Donna Biswas, who's watching from YouTube. She says, in a reading, I found Plains tribals sharing their concern for development in building schools, colleges, and scholarships for SC/ST. Interestingly, that demand is not possible without autonomy. Please reflect.
Okay. See, if we, in Northeast, there are certain states which comes under 6th schedule. But there are also states like Manipur, there is the autonomous district council, which comes under the state legislative assembly, these things. That doesn't have much autonomy. So the kind of autonomous district council, that autonomy being granted by the state to some extent is quite limited. And I echoes and I agree to your propositions, but nevertheless, there are also demands from the people for building of infrastructure, no doubt about it. And here the role of the state also become very crucial. Of course, recognizing those institutions recognized by the state and given more power would be one way forward to also look about in terms of sharing of power structure. I don't know how one could accommodate that in the very complex states like Manipur, for instance. Nagas demands for greater Nagaland, so unification of all the Nagas. Cookies, on the other hand, demands for the Cookie land. And the Zomi, the Paite groups, want to see what the state within the state. And the mighty insurgent groups talks about the restorations of the Kanglapak. And on the other hand, the government of Manipur is stand for, unifications of territorial integrity of the state. So how do one locate in a small state like Manipur, address these issues? But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we shy away and not address it. I think if there is a political will in addressing that, there can be a way forward.
Yes, Abhilasha.
Dr. Ziipao, thank you for your talk. Enjoyed it. Can you please reflect on the various ways in which people of Manipur have demanded infrastructure, and do you see any differences in the way they have demanded? I mean, in the way different tribes probably, or the power struggle probably. How have they demanded?
Say one, okay. Of course, people has demanded. Even the concept in Tamelong, this People's Road, they wanted to connect, to the nearest hospital, to the nearest district headquarters, and all these health facilities. But the state didn't pay attention enough. Hence, they started resorting into building the roads by themselves. Of course, with the initiatives of the IS bureaucrats, who is also himself a part of the state in that matter. So what they did is that they started doing a crowdsourcing, using also Facebook, and also they build 100-kilometer roads, inaugurated and name it as the People's Road that connect, even to Assam, Nagaland, and Manipur. And on the other hand, there are also demands from the people for building the roads in the hill areas. And now we have this called PMGSY. But especially on the rural roads is mostly included in the PMGSY. But one of the issue in this PMGSY, there's supposed to be a provision for maintenance, but that has not been the case. So infrastructural creations without maintenance becomes a liability rather than an asset. So with the demands of the people, those things are also being included in those, under the PMGSY. And the roads, say even in national highways, say places in Nagaland, they have been included and there's started building up. But one way or the other, it get caught in some other controversy.
Are there anyone else has any questions? So I had one more question that if no one else is asking, I was wondering, you were talking of also various ideas of justice and injustice, etc. You were talking of Ambedkar's conception of justice, for example, and talking of injustice as an unequal distribution across communities, across caste groups, and across tribal groups. And I was also, when you were narrating that instance of where a village demanded electricity and they gave them poles, and so they had to construct the poles, and of course there was no wires. I was wondering whether in all of this, whether you had thought of how to think of the question of caste in Northeast, in terms of social hierarchy, maybe not in the same shape and form as we know it in, let's say Hindi heartland. But why I was talking of that instance of, saying a village demanded electricity and they were given poles. There's something in that also, in that act of would you do it in any context to any group of people, to any community, and what is a state that hands over electricity poles to its citizens who are demanding electricity? Right? It says something about questions of humiliation, about questions of dignity, etc. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on thinking of questions of caste in the Northeast, or if that's a useful frame to articulate some of these relations of power.
See, okay, that's some good food for thought. And I've not really given a thought on that aspect though, because in Manipur, no doubt about it, there is a caste element. So if you look at the Maitis and the tribal like Nagas and the Kukis, so nowhere, of course, like Nagas and Kukis, others are fit into the category of these castes. But there are certain communities who also embrace castes and but that again differ very distinctly. So if we look in the case of like Mizoram or in Nagaland, so the question of caste, I don't know how do one address it. Rather, I would look at from the tribes, look as a non-caste society, and also looks about the power dynamics within the different tribal communities. And no doubt there are also the power dynamics, even say in Nagaland. There is also a huge demand from what is called the Eastern Nagaland, which comprises like Kemogan tribes, Konyak, Mon and Toinsan district areas. So one can also look at about in terms of like infrastructure, in terms of availability, accessibility in that of Eastern Nagaland versus of the other parts of the Nagaland. So now that leads to a full-fledged movement of demand in the separate state of the Eastern Nagaland. But the role of the caste, I'm not very sure about that. Look at it. But that is a good thing to ponder upon it, things over it. Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Should I come in?
Yeah, sure, keep going.
Hi, Rocky.
Hey, Kibian.
Sorry, I missed out the first part. I happened to log in only a few minutes back. Okay. Since you work on infrastructure, and I was wondering the highway expansion you must be following in the news in Kaungpi district. Yeah.
In which district come again?
In Kaungpi district.
Okay.
So there has been a lot of hue and cry because of the survey land, unsurvey land, and the DC trying to bulldoze some of the public resentment demands and so on and so forth. So interestingly, Kaungpi district happens to be in the hill district, but Imphal West DC actually is being assigned to do or carry forward some kind of survey. So I was wondering, like, do you also come across such similar kind of thing? Because I thought you might be the right person to be, engaged in such work. So, and or should we say that this is also tantamount to some kind of, coercion of development, as I come across one of the writings of, Professor Khalkha, how tribes are, being part and they're actually being forced to give up their common land, and then because as you all know, like these lands in the hills, again, the only few individuals have this pata, that is the
Yes.
as a proof of their sense of ownership. Otherwise, most of them usually don't go for this because we have these customary laws of
Mhm.
this ownership and all. So how do you see this current scenario in the district which is going on as a consequence of this the national highway or Asian highway expansion?
Mhm. Well, yeah, here I would connect to even not only the highway but the railway project in Tamelong district, like the parts which connect to that also become very contentious, and the expansion of highway is another example. As you rightly pointed out, many of the tribal areas doesn't have the land pata systems and also doesn't cover under Manipur Land Revenue Act. So that becomes very tricky in the parts of to determine in both in terms of compensations as well as rehabilitations, and also one thinking about the development aspect. So here I would see that the moment tribal laws the voice to determine, okay, how he should be surveyed, that amounts to injustice. So when these acts is not been implemented, is not been covered, it is the community or it is the tribal community who should have the authority to even survey. So here I would echo to what Professor Kaka articles on the correlations of development, and also one when we look at about that highway, where does it connect? It connects to what is today called this Asian Highway number one, and that Asian Highway number one is supposed to be the longest route, and it goes and connect to the trilateral highway. So I think there is a larger one can look at about the political economy and also power dynamics. And even yesterday, recently, the deputy commissioner of this Kampopi was, there is some contestation because of the survey. I did follow that up, yeah.
Anyway, even I don't have a first-hand information. I'm just relying on this social media and all. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Kipkin. Anyone else who has any other questions or comments? If there are no more questions, then we can. Okay, it seems like no more questions. So thank you so much, Rocky, for coming and joining us and sharing your book with us. And we all look forward to reading it in greater detail and engaging with it more. And it was, I think we also had a nice, rich discussion, a good amount of back and forth, good amount of questions and all that. So thanks so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you also to Rubul, who is managing all the technical part, which has become so central in all our lives now. And thanks to Vikas for making the poster for us.
All right, thank you
Thanks.
so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Thanks. We'll be in touch.